I clicked the tab, closed without a word. No sigh, no curse, just one long breath as I stared at the number that had just appeared on my screen. My bonus projection, 0. My name's Mason Hart. I'm 41 years old, and I work, or at least I used to, at Stratwell Dynamics, a mid-sized tech firm headquartered in Austin, Texas. My official title was Senior Client Solutions Director, but titles at Stratwell rarely reflected reality. You didn't get applause at our company for making noise. You got noticed for making things happen. And that's what I did. Quietly. Consistently. Especially when others dropped the ball. 3 weeks ago, I single-handedly salvaged a deal that had been circling the drain for months. It was a $5.2 million software contract with a renewable energy conglomerate based in Calgary. The original team had let it stagnate. Too many miscommunications, too much jargon, and zero follow-through. I came in when it was already bleeding out. I didn't make noise. I rebuilt the entire thing brick by brick. That meant flying north in the dead of January, when even the sales guys made excuses about schedule conflicts. I stood on icy construction grounds to walk through specs with their site engineer. I translated the legalese into plain English over back-to-back calls with compliance officers and field managers. There were moments I slept in airport hotels just to stay within reach of their executive team. But it worked. On a gray Wednesday morning, their CFO signed the dotted line. 2 days later, Friday afternoon, I noticed something odd. The internal deal tracking system we used had quietly reassigned the Alberta contract. The record no longer listed me as lead. Instead, credit had been split between legal and procurement. 2 departments that, for the record, had done nothing more than rubber stamp final language I had already negotiated. At the bottom of the revision note, one name stood out, reviewed by Jared Collins. Jared was recently promoted to Vice President of Strategic Growth, less than 2 months prior. A rising star, big on corporate buzzwords, light on details. He favored presentations with clean gradients and big vision boards, talked about cross-functional synergy like it was a religion. He never joined a single call during the Alberta negotiations, but he had full access to deal logs. And now he was the one reviewing ownership entries. Later that day, he strolled by my desk, holding a coffee cup like it was a scepter. "Quick heads up," he said, flashing a rehearsed grin. "We're making some tweaks to how we allocate bonus credit across divisions. New initiative from the top, just part of a broader shift in how we recognize contributions." He didn't stop walking. I didn't answer, just slid open the drawer on my right and pulled out my black Moleskine notebook. Not for therapy, but for record keeping. I jotted the time, the exact phrasing he used, the deal ID, and the version number from the platform. Because when someone tries to erase you, they don't do it loudly. They do it in silence, through policy memos, through access changes, through language so slippery it doesn't leave fingerprints. 10 minutes later, Amber, who used to assist with the client success team before the last restructuring chopped her role in half, walked by my desk. She glanced at my screen, then at me. Her eyes lingered a second too long before she gave a small, knowing nod. No words, just confirmation. The first time this kind of thing happens, you assume it's an error. The second time, you wonder if it's just the way the corporate machine ticks. But by the third, you start preparing. Because there's a pattern to corporate erasure. First they realign, then they simplify, and then, if no one's looking, they forget. Not by mistake, by design. But forgetting only works when no one remembers. And I remembered everything. That weekend I stayed low. No complaints. No Slack messages. Just waited. The following Monday, my invite to the weekly forecast call disappeared. No explanation. I had been part of that meeting since the early days. Hell, I helped build the forecast model we still used. But now the slot was blank. I walked past the glass conference room at 10:02 a.m. Everyone was there, except me. I glanced at the presentation on the screen. There was 5 top-tier active contracts listed. Alberta was number 2. The metrics were identical to the ones I had submitted. Except this time, there was no mention of me. Jared stood confidently near the head of the table, gesturing at the slides like a man who'd weathered every storm. His voice was smooth. His points were clipped. The phrasing sounded like a cleaned-up version of my own summary, reworded just enough to claim plausible authorship. Later that day, a friend from the analytics team quietly forwarded me the official reporting slide. Figured you might want a copy, he said. Alberta's deal ownership? Led J. Collins. No co-leads. No annotations. I archived the file without a word. Then I opened my personal version of the timeline, stored offline, secure. I updated it with the most recent rollout checkpoints the client had approved just the day before. That evening, their project manager called. She had a question about the revised delivery milestone. Said no one from our side could give her a straight answer. So I did, step by step. No tension, just clarity. She never asked why I wasn't listed as the lead. She didn't need to. She already knew. Tuesday morning, I came in early. Not to be the first, not to prove anything, just to see how deep the rewrite had gone. I booted up, opened the Stratwell share drive, and noticed a change immediately. The Alberta contract folder had been renamed. No more project code. No more initials. Just a generic tag. Northern Expansion, Phase 1. Clean, bland, impersonal. Inside, most of the core documents were still there. But they weren't mine. Not really. The files had been rolled back to earlier versions. Safe, incomplete snapshots that looked presentable but lacked the final client-approved modifications. I checked the metadata. My edits were gone. My formatting stripped. Even the audit log had gaps. Entries deleted, probably by someone with elevated permissions. They weren't erasing the deal. They were erasing the path. And that's what scared me more than anything. Because once a system forgets how it was built, it becomes vulnerable. Fragile. Hollow. So I downloaded everything. Quietly. No changes. No alerts. Just mirrored the files into an encrypted drive that only I had access to. The real versions. The ones the client had signed off on. The ones that still had fingerprints, mine. That afternoon, Jared issued a department-wide memo. Subject, Strategic Visibility Initiative. Gist? All external communications were now to be funneled through a newly created Visibility Review Panel, which, conveniently, reported to him. A junior analyst fresh out of business school was tasked with screening every outgoing message related to high-value clients. On paper, it looked like an efficiency measure. In reality, it was a gate, a filter, but I had already made my move. Amber, the former assistant, walked by again on her coffee break. She tilted her head toward my monitor. Saw the new gatekeeper, she asked, tone dry. I nodded without looking up. Funny, she continued. Things only get centralized when someone's already lost control. Then she walked off, not waiting for a reply. She didn't need one. By the end of the week, Jared had reassigned 2 more key accounts under his portfolio. On paper, it looked clean. Internally, it was chaos. The team folders showed him as lead, but questions, updates, clarifications. Somehow, they still found their way to my inbox. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't raise flags. I just answered. Accurately. Promptly. Without commentary. If they still came to me, it meant they still knew where the real map lived. And then something small happened that told me everything I needed to know. A client engineer emailed a technical question. Something about the API integration sequence for the Alberta platform. The original message was sent to Jared, but had been quietly forwarded to me with a single line. They said you'd know. No confusion. No fluff. Just quiet trust. I replied with the correct answer and attached the appropriate documentation. That night, in Jared's weekly team update, a sentence appeared at the bottom in smaller font. Mason assisted with technical confirmation. He had begun to rely on work he no longer controlled. And that was the moment the power started to shift. Not visibly, not in titles or seating charts, but underneath, where it really mattered. Later that week, I noticed another change. Several files I maintained had their access altered. Share permissions revoked. Certain documents had been marked view only. Some links no longer worked unless accessed directly from my version. No one had asked for this, but people noticed. One by one, team members began stopping by my desk, not to chat, not to gossip, but to ask, "Hey, do you still have the revised compliance summary from Q4? Do you know which rollout sheet is the final one? I can't find it in Jared's folder. Which budget projection did the client sign off on?" Each time, I gave them what they needed. Clean, complete, Quiet. No lecture. No reminder. Just a real file. Amber stopped by again, this time with a raised brow. Someone just pinged me for a slide I know got deleted last month, she said. I looked up from my keyboard. You think they're catching on yet? She smirked. Not yet. But the version they think they're using? It's a ghost. You've already moved the system. And she was right. Because by then, there were two versions of Stratwell's operations. The one Jared polished and presented, and the one that actually worked, held together by quiet confirmations, buried emails, and a map that only I still carried in full. Later that night, I sat alone in the office. The hallway lights had dimmed. The sound of the HVAC hummed softly above. I opened my notebook, page 47. I wrote down everything that had happened in the past 3 days. File renames, access changes, deleted logs, staff who'd quietly asked for the right version. The pattern was becoming too familiar. They were still trying to run the machine, but I was the only one left who knew how the engine fit together. And that would matter soon, because the higher up you go, the more dangerous it becomes to trust the wrong blueprint. By the middle of the following week, it wasn't just whispers and private messages anymore. The quiet divergence that had once lived in the background, in inbox threads, forgotten folders, and circled printouts, was beginning to show in places that mattered. Places where perception held more weight than process. The Alberta project was still moving, technically. The reports were still going out. Jared was still standing in front of conference screens, gesturing like a conductor to a melody that no longer played through him. But people had started asking small questions, innocent, practical, seemingly routine, like why the compliance tracker listed outdated numbers, or why the resource allocation sheet was missing last month's adjustments, or why, when the client requested a delivery checkpoint update, it took 2 layers of forwarding just to get a coherent response. Each time, Jared provided an answer. Smooth, general, practiced, but never precise. Precision had moved elsewhere. Then came a call, the one that shifted everything without raising a single voice. It started, as most corporate turning points do, not with drama, but with an agenda item tucked quietly inside a quarterly check-in. The CEO, Thomas Callaway, had scheduled a routine call with the Alberta client's executive lead, a standard touchpoint, just to keep strategic partnerships warm and check on alignment for long-term goals. But the client had something else on their mind. Halfway through the conversation, just after the small talk and before the roadmap discussion, they asked a question, simple, direct, unembellished. Will Mason Hart continue to be involved in the next phase? Not your team, not Stratwell, not even client strategy. They used my name. Clearly, intentionally. That single sentence traveled through more channels in one day than any report Jared had filed in 3 weeks. Not because it was loud, but because it was specific. Because in a system full of titles and faceless roles, specificity is what pierces the fog. The message landed on the desk of the CEO's executive assistant first, forwarded as part of a meeting summary. She added one line beneath the highlight. Tom would like to understand Mason's current involvement. There was no accusation, no panic, just a nudge, a prompt, an indication that someone at the very top had finally heard something that didn't match the script they'd been handed. When the email reached me, I stared at it for a long moment, not because I was surprised, but because it felt like the first crack in a wall I had been leaning against for months. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I compiled a document, not a pitch, not a defense, not some grand appeal for recognition. Just a summary. Clean, neutral, time-stamped. It included my direct communications with the client, an overview of their requested updates, a breakdown of implementation stages, and notes on each delivery checkpoint I had guided to completion. No rhetoric, no angle, just facts. A day later, I was invited to a brief meeting. 15 minutes, the assistant said. No formal prep required. When I walked into the room, Tom Callaway was already seated. The man didn't rise, didn't extend a hand. He just gestured to the chair across from him and held up a printout, my Alberta contract summary, the real one, the one with my name in the margins and the original metadata still intact. He asked only one question. Did you build this? I looked him in the eye, steady and without hesitation. Yes. He nodded once. "Thank you," he said, and that was it. No explanation, no probing, just recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that the map had been wrong, and someone had finally found the source. I walked out of that room without fanfare, without promotion, without applause. But when I got back to my desk, things had already started moving. My name had reappeared on the access permissions for half a dozen files. Not manually, systemically. Someone had pulled the lever and reset the visibility lines. Jared didn't say anything. Not directly. But the tone of his next apartment update shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Gone were the sweeping declarations about growth metrics and synergy pipelines. In their place were cautious updates, tentative observations, sentences that hedged, paragraphs that deferred. At the very bottom of the document, one line stood out. Final approval pending with M. Hart. It wasn't deference. It wasn't humility. It was survival. People in the department began noticing, not because I said anything, but because the current had changed direction. A product manager who hadn't spoken to me in weeks forwarded a slide deck and asked for my thoughts. A finance analyst wanted clarification on a discount clause I'd written 6 months prior. A delivery coordinator sent over a note. "I think your version is the one we should anchor on." No one used titles. No one said, "Go ask Mason, he's the boss." They just asked and waited, because somewhere along the way, they had stopped following the system that had been presented to them. They had started following the one that worked. And that version had my name on every layer. By Thursday morning, the difference became visible, not just in the files or the reports, but in how people moved, in how they paused at doorways, in the way they glanced toward my desk before committing to a decision. It was subtle at first. A manager asking to cross-check a compliance date. A junior analyst pinging me to confirm which resource table to use in the financial projection. But beneath those simple questions was something deeper, something shifting. People weren't seeking answers anymore. They were seeking assurance. And assurance never comes from structure. It comes from someone who actually remembers where the structure came from. Jared, for all his posture and polish, had begun to feel that shift too. His slides remained crisp, his charts well aligned, but his tone had changed. He no longer spoke in definitive declarations. Instead, his words bent, just slightly, with each sentence, looking for soft landings, checking the room for signs of approval. In one meeting, a discrepancy surfaced. A rollout timeline on his deck clashed with the projected staffing schedule. Jared hesitated, not for long, just a second, but in that pause, the room noticed. Not the delay itself, but the reason behind it. He no longer had the authority of someone carrying the map. He had become a messenger unsure of the route. Later that afternoon, a knock came at my door. Jenna, one of the managers from Client Ops, stood with a printed dashboard in hand. "These numbers," she said, "don't match last week's report. 2 fields are off." I scanned the sheet. Sure enough, they'd been copied from an outdated version. The system hadn't changed, the source had. And the source, once again, wasn't Jared. I corrected the numbers, printed a clean version, and handed it back. She nodded, said nothing more, and walked out. No drama, no credit, just function. And function, I realized, had begun to recenter itself around the only thing that had stayed stable. Clarity. Not position, not power, just clarity. By the end of that week, 5 separate people had requested access to documents I kept offline. None of them did it publicly. No one tagged Jared. No one copied leadership. These were quiet messages. Direct. Respectful. I didn't gatekeep. I just sent them what they needed. That Friday, Lucy, the one who used to assist the client success team before the last restructure pushed her into a floating admin role, stopped by with a manila folder. Inside were transcripts from 2 strategy meetings I hadn't attended. My name appeared in both. Not as a participant, as a reference. "They're building their decisions around your data," she said, half amused, half resigned. And she wasn't wrong. The official structure still stood. Org charts intact, permissions unchanged, titles unshaken. But underneath, a second system had emerged. One that lived in email threads, in hallway conversations, in the unspoken hierarchy of who gets asked first. And that system pointed in one direction. One Monday later, a director forwarded me a client email. It was a routine logistics request. Move the delivery checkpoint by 4 days to accommodate an internal audit. But the detail that mattered wasn't in the request itself. It was in the address line. They hadn't sent it to a department inbox. They hadn't even included Jared. They sent it to me. Only me. No note. No justification. Just trust. I processed the change, updated the rollout doc in my private archive, and moved on. The next team meeting, Jared still stood at the front. Same navy blazer. Same cadence. Same carefully worded slides. But the energy in the room had shifted. When he mentioned compliance updates, eyes turned toward me. Not in challenge. In confirmation. Because when people stop believing in the system they're handed, they start watching the one that actually moves. After that session, I passed by Lucy's desk. She tapped a folder and said, "He just asked me if you had the final forecast version." I raised an eyebrow. "I told him," she said with a small grin, "you didn't have it. You wrote it." That was the moment I knew the center of gravity had changed. Not with an announcement, not with a promotion, but with usage. The most powerful shift in any organization doesn't happen when someone is given a title. It happens when everyone quietly starts acting like they already have it. By the next week, even Jared's language adapted. His updates stopped projecting forward. His bullet points shortened. He began echoing phrases I had used a week earlier. One line at the bottom of a report read, "Adjusted per M, Hart's updated schedule." No one questioned it. No one even looked up. The realignment had already taken root, not in policy, but in practice. Not in authority, but in trust. By the second week of March, things that used to require authority began shifting toward familiarity. An engineer forwarding a spec review, just in case you see something I missed. A partner emailing at 6:37 a.m. asking if I could glance over this compliance matrix, even though it had already passed 2 department heads. These weren't mistakes. They were choices. Quiet ones. The kind people make when they don't trust the map, but trust the cartographer. The formal systems kept functioning on the surface. Jared's name was still listed on the project briefs. His email signature still carried the title. He still opened team meetings with his usual confidence, still nodded at the right points, still asked for alignment like it was a magic word. But now, every answer he gave felt like a house built on someone else's foundation, and everyone could feel the tremble in the floor. It started small, an update that needed verification, then a timeline that didn't match the current rollout, then an audit question about document versions that no longer aligned with the ones in the shared folder. Each time, someone would quietly circle back to me, not because they were instructed to, but because they had learned where clarity lived. Lucy came by one morning holding a report printout with red marks all over the margins. She tapped one corner. "They used your structure again," she said flatly. I took the page. Same layout. Same table format. Same color codes. The only difference was the header, sent from Jared's account. I didn't flinch. This wasn't theft. It was dependency. He had stopped building and started borrowing. And what he was borrowing was me. One afternoon, I received a message from a senior client coordinator asking for a final sign-off on a revised policy note. There was no mention of Jared. No question about who held the authority. Just a simple, "Can you confirm this before Friday?" I opened the doc, scanned the changes, signed it digitally, and replied within the hour. The next day, a director forwarded that signed version to the executive team with one clean line at the top, cleared through Mason. Nobody edited that line. Nobody asked why my name was there, because everyone already understood the answer. The system was adjusting, not because of a memo, not because of a realignment, but because systems, when broken, don't always crash. Sometimes they just shift around the person still holding the instructions. Jared, meanwhile, kept showing up early to meetings, kept trying to explain things he no longer had access to. I noticed his voice growing tighter, his phrasing less certain. He asked questions in one-on-ones that he used to answer. He hovered longer near desks, sat closer to projectors, opened his laptop faster, hoping that speed might substitute for substance. But substance was no longer his to claim. Later that week, I walked into a strategy session. A junior staffer was presenting an onboarding model for a new client vertical. She called it the Alberta Framework. I blinked once, waited, then asked quietly, "Is that the official name?" She nodded. "Yeah, legal added it to the glossary last quarter. It's what they use now." I said nothing, because what else was there to say? The framework they'd tried to scrub my name from now carried it. Not ceremonially, functionally. And that kind of legacy doesn't come from signing the right file. It comes from building the thing no one else bothered to understand. A few days after the Alberta Framework became official, something unexpected happened. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet in that unsettling way a machine makes no sound when it stops working. A delay surfaced in another department. One of those minor hiccups that doesn't make headlines, but still burns 3 days on the calendar. Just a misaligned figure between two dashboards. Harmless at first glance, except no one could trace the change. They tried. They pulled reports. They dug through logs. They reran imports from the share drive. And then, after nearly 72 hours of chasing their own tail, someone finally found the original document. The real one, the correct one, the version that reconciled everything. And in the metadata, my initials. Not because I was still part of the chain, but because no one had ever replaced the foundation. I had quietly stepped away from the formal threads, handed over the keys, let the system move on. And yet, 3 weeks later, it still depended on something I'd built, something no one else had understood deeply enough to replicate. That's the thing about systems. They don't remember what they were built on until something breaks. The following morning, a team lead knocked softly on my open door, held up a printed file with an apologetic smile. "Do you still have access to the early escalation flow?" she asked. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to help, but because when I checked the system, my permissions had been revoked. I was no longer part of the loop. I had been edited out. I looked up at her and said, "You'll have to check the new version. I'm not in it anymore." She nodded slowly, lips pressed into a thin line, and left without another word. That evening, I opened my drawer and pulled out the black notebook, the one I started the day my name vanished from the Alberta project. I flipped through pages filled with notes, timestamps, phrases, system IDs, names. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I closed the notebook gently and left it in the drawer. Not hidden, just there, waiting, because someone, someday, was going to need to remember where things started. The next week, another issue surfaced. Same platform, different client, different timeline, same confusion. A field in the dashboard didn't align with a back-end query. Finance flagged it. Ops couldn't fix it. Engineering denied owning it. And once again, when they dug deep enough beneath all the layers of who managed what and who approved which, it led back to a version of a file I had created 8 months ago. Because context, real, unshakable context, never forgets who wrote the first line. That's when I realized something essential, something few people in power ever fully understand. When you try to erase the person who built the system, you don't just lose their name. You lose the ability to understand it. And when the system forgets you, but still relies on you, it collapses in silence, one unresolved field at a time. By the time spring fully settled in, the office had shifted in ways that no quarterly roadmap or reorg announcement could explain. People still arrived at 8:30, still filled their mugs with burnt coffee from the same shared pot, still tapped their key cards at the elevator with the same half-aware reflex. But something in the current had reversed. The same directors who once nodded politely in passing without slowing down now paused near my desk with half-formed questions. The same analysts who once routed their updates through Jared now quietly CC'd me without comment. There was no meeting about it, no alignment strategy. It was simply gravity doing what gravity does best, pulling everything back to where it had always belonged. One by one, they returned, not out of obligation, out of necessity, because it turns out that in every complex system, there is a hidden architecture, something no org chart shows, no title reflects. And when the glossy version collapses under its own weight, the invisible one becomes visible. I didn't need to chase anything. I never had. One afternoon, a delivery lead stopped by with a file she was supposed to review for an upcoming cross-client audit. It was a templated risk form, standard, procedural, the kind of thing Jared's team now handled. She asked if I had a moment to just look at a few fields. I did. They were wrong. The structure looked familiar, copied, clearly, but the logic behind the dependencies had been altered. Can I ask where this version came from? I asked. She hesitated, then admitted quietly, "It's Jared's." I said nothing, just pushed my chair back, opened a drawer, and handed her the correct version, dated, signed, and internally referenced by the client's original language. Her eyes widened slightly as she scanned the differences. She didn't thank me. She didn't need to. We both understood what had happened. They had followed the new map until it broke. And when it broke, they came back to the man who had drawn the first one. That same week, a partner from a different division forwarded me a message with no context, just a line in bold. Which version of the Alberta schedule is final? The question had not been directed to me, but it found its way to me anyway. Lucy passed by again later that day, folder in hand, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "They're still pretending they know," she said, placing the folder on my desk. "But they're watching you for the answer." Inside were side-by-side versions of a timeline report, one from Jared's team, one from mine. The former looked polished. The latter looked used and trusted, because that's the thing people forget about power. It's never about who speaks the loudest. It's about who gets called when the room goes quiet. The following Monday, Jared opened the weekly sync with his usual introduction, but his pace was different. More pauses, more disclaimers, more, "we'll need to circle back on that," than anyone in the room could remember. At one point, a stakeholder asked about a clause in the delivery terms. Jared glanced around, offered a vague response, and then, almost as if by instinct, said, "Mason can probably speak to that." No one blinked. No one looked surprised. He had deferred, openly, publicly, and the room accepted it like gravity. After the meeting, he passed me in the hall. No nod, no eye contact, just a blur of navy wool and cologne. Lucy stood a few feet away, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. When Jared was out of earshot, she said, "He just asked me if you had access to the final forecast." I smiled faintly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you didn't just have it. You are it." She walked away after that, but her words stayed. Because for the first time, someone had said out loud what the entire office had already begun to feel. I wasn't holding power. I had become the power source itself. Not by force, not by ambition, but by remaining immovable when everything else tried to forget. By the time April rolled in, the official reports had begun to feel like echoes, polished, branded, time-stamped, but always one layer removed from the truth. Jared still sent them. The chart still looked clean. The bullet points still followed the corporate tone guide. But inside the teams, beneath the shared dashboards and departmental folders, a different rhythm had taken hold. One that no longer started with what was said, but with what could be trusted. Trust, it turned out, had a location, and it lived in the versions people quietly saved in their own drives, the versions they didn't acknowledge in meetings, but forwarded when things got serious. Those files had one thing in common: my structure, my formatting, my naming conventions. No signature, no watermark. But everyone knew. That's when I realized something strange. I had become the index of the company. Not the face, not the authority, but the reference point everyone returned to when facts stopped lining up. One Thursday morning, a finance manager sent me a question about a discount clause that had apparently been updated in Jared's master spreadsheet. I opened the version he attached. At first glance, it looked accurate, but the formula had changed subtly, enough that the totals were skewed by nearly 0.5%. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to mislead a forecast. I sent back the original clause, along with a note. This is what was agreed to with legal last October. See version 3.7. 5 minutes later, the reply came in. Thanks. That's what I thought. Just needed to be sure. No argument. No back and forth. Just confirmation that the version he had been handed didn't feel right, until mine proved it. That same day, Lucy dropped a hard copy on my desk. It was the executive review agenda for the quarter. She tapped the bottom line. 3 different teams added footnotes, saying based on hard version. You didn't submit anything, did you? I shook my head slowly. No, I said, but they know where it came from. Later that week, one of Jared's own team leads came to my desk. awkward, hesitant, looking like someone who had wrestled with the decision for too long. She asked if I still had the initial rollout model from the Alberta project, the one that had used tiered check-in markers based on compliance windows instead of phase milestones. I didn't say anything. I just handed her the file. She took it in silence, turned, and said before walking away, "We tried to rebuild it. It didn't hold." That was the word she used, hold. Not work, not match. Hold. Because the thing about foundations is they're not just built to function. They're built to carry weight. And no matter how clean the new walls looked, they had been stacked on hollow ground. Jared kept presenting. He still walked into meetings early, still used the same 5-slide opener, still positioned himself in front of the screen like a man anchoring the room. But more often now, his updates included phrases like pending with Mason or verified by M. Hart. Not in bold, never in the opening line, but they were there, like footnotes in a paper where the professor had quietly rewritten the syllabus. No one questioned it. No one challenged the shift, because by now, everyone had accepted the truth. There was the version they were supposed to follow, and the version they actually checked when it mattered. And that second version lived with me, not behind a title, not inside a dashboard, but inside a system that had quietly rearranged itself around the only person who never stopped holding the whole thing together. It happened on a Tuesday, not because Tuesdays matter, but because so often the real shifts come on the quietest days. No celebration, no agenda, just a folder on my desk and a note attached in blue ink. We need someone who already knows where this is going. Think about it. It came from the chief operating officer. Inside the folder was a formal offer, a new title, Director of Strategic Delivery. Clean language, no filler, no politics, just a redefinition of what I had already been doing, this time with visibility, budget authority, and a team that would officially report to me. I closed the folder, didn't open it again for the rest of the day, because I wasn't sure if I needed it. By then, the machine had already pivoted, not by decree, but by momentum, not by appointment, but by need. People weren't asking me to lead. They were already following without ever saying the word. What the company wanted now was to put a nameplate on it, to give structure to what had already become gravity. But I hesitated, not because I didn't want the responsibility. I had carried that for months already, quietly, but because once something becomes official, it gets surrounded by the very systems that failed to protect it the first time. And I wasn't sure I wanted to spend my energy protecting that system anymore. Lucy noticed the folder on my desk. She didn't ask, just gave a knowing look. Later that week, the audit team scheduled a walkthrough of all current major client deliverables. I wasn't on the formal agenda, but every time a question came up about timelines, about compliance versions, about resource projections, someone in the room looked at me. No one said it out loud, but the answer always came from my side of the table. After the meeting, one of the newer analysts walked beside me in the hallway. She was sharp, quiet, but observant in the way people are when they've learned not to trust titles too quickly. She asked, "Were you always behind the Alberta project?" I said, "Yes." Nothing more. She nodded, made a note in her folder, and walked away. That was the tone of everything now. No ceremony, no announcement, just movement, real, quiet, inevitable movement toward the version of the work that held up under pressure. And the strange thing was the higher-ups weren't resisting it anymore. They had seen what happened when visibility was given to the wrong hands. And now they were trying gently, politely, to center the system where it had always functioned best. But I didn't give an answer. Not yet. Because part of me still believed that real leadership doesn't come from a title. It comes from trust earned in silence. And that trust was already mine. A week passed, then another. The folder from So never left my desk. It stayed there unmoved, unopened since the day it arrived. Not out of defiance, not out of fear, but because I understood what it really was. Not an offer, a signal. It said, "We've seen what you've built." It said, "You were never invisible, just inconvenient." And it said, "We want to catch up to the version of this company that's already forming around you." But the strange thing was, I didn't need the offer anymore. Not really, because by now, everyone who mattered had stopped waiting for a nameplate to tell them who to trust. They knew. They had seen the work hold through friction. They had watched reports quietly redirect themselves toward me. They had followed the line of clarity through failed versions and shiny presentations and found that it always ended in one place: the quiet desk, the black notebook, the man who never left. One afternoon, the CFO's office sent a message down to operations, asking for clarification on 3 high-priority items: Alberta's compliance trail, Western rollout variants, and a discrepancy in the service tier model. The request was formal, typed, archived. But next to each line, someone had handwritten 3 words in pen. Ask Mason Hart. No one routed it through Jared. No one even pretended to. And when I opened the relevant files, I realized something quietly profound. I hadn't needed access to the system, because, in a way, the system had become mine. The logic, the flow, the decisions people actually followed. All of it had slowly, steadily migrated to wherever the real answers lived. And the real answers had my initials in the audit trail, not because I forced them there, but because no one else had ever replaced the foundation. So when they asked again, this time more formally, with a calendar invite labeled Leadership Transition Discussion, I declined. Politely, clearly. Then I added one line to the reply. I'm happy to train the right person, but I'm not here to perform authority. I'm here to protect the work. They accepted that with surprising grace, because even the executives now understood the map didn't need a title. It needed a guardian. A week later, Lucy came by with a folder. This one wasn't from the C-suite. It was internal, marked for compliance review. It showed a stakeholder map across all active verticals. She pointed at the Alberta account. Next to account owner, one line stood. M. Hart. She smiled. They tried to split this 6 ways last quarter, she said. Now, no one's even asking. Across the office, Jared still held meetings. His badge still carried the same title. But his updates now required confirmation before being submitted. His charts used metrics I maintained. His delivery timelines were quietly rerouted to files only I had full context for. No one took anything away from him, but no one sent anything through him anymore. And that's how the system truly changed. Not with a bang, but with 1,000 small decisions made in silence, until the only path left standing was the one I had never stopped walking. One evening, I walked past a project room where a team was working late. On the whiteboard, someone had drawn a new delivery model and circled a central pillar in red ink. Underneath it, 3 words, based on Hart. No one saw me standing there, but I smiled anyway, because that's the moment I understood what legacy really is. It's not what you're called. It's what stays standing when you leave the room. If this story hit home, hit like, leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes the strongest people are the ones who don't say a word. They just keep the system running.